Good evening, one and all. National Gallery of Modern Art, Bengaluru, Ministry of Culture, Government of India, in collaboration with BVB, Gandhi Center for Science and Human Values, welcomes you to the slide talk presentation on India's Scientific Heritage in Medicine and Surgery by Professor M S Valiathan. May I now call Ambassador Retired Shri Alan Nazareth, the Chairman of Gandhi Center for Science and Human Values, onto the dais to introduce the speaker of the day.
I thank you all for being here this evening. It's a special occasion for us at the Gandhi Center. Ever since I took over as chairman, I have introduced the series of lectures and various aspects of the Indian heritage in the spiritual and scientific field. We have already done one on India's spiritual heritage. After that, we've done lectures in the field of astronomy. We did one on the ancient Indus civilization. And today we are really very privileged to be able to present Professor Shankaran Valiathan to deliver the lecture on India's scientific heritage in the field of medicine and surgery. He's really a legend from what he has achieved. He's a great scholar on the particular field of India's heritage in medicine and surgery. But he's, more importantly, one of India's leading cardiac surgeons. In fact, that is his main specialization. He graduated from the university, from the medical college in Trivandrum. Then he went on to Liverpool, where he graduated, got his PhD, then went on to the US, studied at George Washington and two other universities, and then came back to India in 1972. Worked initially at the Safdarjung Hospital, then at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. 1974, he was invited by the then Maharaja of Travancore, of Kerala, I'm sorry, the Chief Minister of Kerala, to come and set up a new medical college for specialties, a specialized hospital, which he did. And he did it so efficiently, in fact, that within 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, it was declared an institute of national eminence. It is therefore now no longer a Kerala government college, but it's a national college which is funded by the central government. His bio is mind-boggling, so I'm going to only read you snippets out of it. But I would like all of you to know the full bio. So I've made some copies, there are 15 or 20 of them. So any of you who would like the full bio can get it from me after the talk. Now, he is an erstwhile president of the Indian National Science Academy and National Research Professor of the Government of India. He was awarded the Padma Vibhushan in 2005 for his contributions to health technology in India. He was made a Chevalier in the Order of the Palme Académique, an honor bestowed by the French government in 1999. He received the Samuel P. Asper International Award from the Johns Hopkins University Medical School in 2009. When he retired from the Sri Chitra Tirunal Institute in Trivandrum, he accepted to be the Vice Chancellor of the Manipal University. When he finished with that, he began to put down all that he had learned over the years in the field of ancient, of India's heritage in the field of medicine and surgery, and published The Legacy of Charaka. Later on, as National Research Professor, he carried out a study of Sushruta and Vagbhata and completed the series of legacy of this legacy on the great three of Ayurveda. Now, before I request him to start to deliver his lecture, I would like to read out to you just one para from Will Durant's amazing subchapter on what he calls India's work in science. He covers the entire field from astronomy to chemistry to various things, including medicine and surgery. This one paragraph reads as follows. The records of Hindu medicine begin with the Atharva Veda, where embedded in a mass of magic and incantations is a list of diseases with their symptoms. Medicine arose as an adjunct to magic. The healer studied and used earthly means to cure to help his spiritual formulas. Later, he relied more and more upon such secular methods, continuing the magic spell, like our bedside manner, as a psychological aid. Appended to the Atharva Veda is the Ayurveda, the science of longevity. In this oldest system of Hindu medicine, illness is attributed to disorder in one of the four humors: air, water, phlegm, and blood. And treatment is recommended with herbs and charms. Many of its diagnoses and cures are still used in India with a success that is sometimes the envy of Western physicians. The Rig Veda names over 1,000 such herbs and advocates water as the best cure for most diseases. Even in Vedic times, physicians and surgeons were being differentiated from magic doctors and were living in houses surrounded by gardens in which they cultivated medicinal plants. The great names in Hindu medicine are those of Sushruta in the 5th century BC and Charaka in the 2nd century AD. Sushruta, professor of medicine in the University of Benares, wrote down in Sanskrit a system of diagnosis and therapy whose elements had descended to him from his teacher Dhanvantari. His book dealt at length with surgery, obstetrics, diet, bathing, drugs, infant feeding and hygiene, and medical education. Charaka composed a Samhita, or encyclopedia of medicine, which is still used in India, and gave to his followers an almost Hippocratic conception of their calling. Not for self, not for the fulfillment of any earthly desire of gain, but solely for the good, suffering humanity, should you treat your patients and so excel all. I now request Professor Valiathan, please to come and deliver your lecture, and many, many thanks again that you have kindly accepted our invitation. We are greatly honored.
Esteemed invitees, ladies and gentlemen, I am greatly honored and very happy to be here this evening to give a talk on India's heritage in medicine and surgery. I am very thankful for the gracious words of welcome from Ambassador Nasrat, and thank you all for being with me this evening. I would first of all say that when we talk about India's heritage in medicine, I'll be confining myself to Ayurveda, but I should not give the impression that Ayurveda is the only medical heritage of India. We have a very large heritage of folk medicine, much of it unwritten, practiced by millions of people, especially in the tribal areas of India. And this is not something which we should ignore, because there is a lot of hidden knowledge there, which requires a great deal of effort to find something which can be universally applicable. In fact, Charaka, the first century, he says specifically in his Samhita to young Ayurvedic trainees, if you want to learn about medicinal plants, you must talk to the forest dwellers. He says that. So we have a very large heritage. Second is the Unani system, which is practiced by millions of people. And thirdly is the Siddha system, practiced especially in Tamil Nadu, again by millions of people. So I won't be speaking about these, not because they are not important, but simply because I don't know enough about them. So I will not be referring to them. Talking about Ayurveda, now here is a painting of Charaka, I'm sorry. You have already heard the name from Ambassador Nazareth. And Charaka is a legendary person who is the person who redacted the Charaka Samhita, about which you will be hearing again and again. That is the foundational text of Ayurveda, still being taught in the Ayurvedic colleges, used by physicians. And so this painting, it is adorning the wall of the Kalabhavan Museum in Benares. When I went to Benares some 15 years ago, I was being taken around that Roerich gallery because Nikolai Roerich, when he passed away, he gifted all his paintings to Benares University. So they have a gallery, Roerich Gallery. As I was being taken around, I found here is a painting. There was no title. I thought this person in that painting was coming out of the wall and walking towards me. That was Charaka. I asked Professor Biswas, who was accompanying me, I asked him, whose painting is this? He said, this is Charaka looking for medicinal plants. And the great painter, Roerich, he captured the majesty of Charaka, his far-seeing eye brimming with compassion, and his almost sense of identification with the Himalayas. Because in Charaka Samhita, in many places you will find he refers to Himalayas, Himalayan valleys, Himalayan plants. He was in love with the Himalayas. This painting captures all that. That is Charaka. Now, what did Charaka say about Ayurveda? Now, Charaka exhorted the students of Ayurveda that they must be reverential to Atharva Veda. You heard the quotation from Will Durant. He says the same. They must be loyal. They must be reverential to Atharva Veda. Atharva Veda dates back to 1500 of BC, or before Christ, or what we say, before current era. That is the current terminology, BCE, 1500. That is the agreed consensus. Now, this Atharva Veda has 5,000 hymns and 1,000 prose lines. It's a very big book. So Maurice Bloomfield was a professor of Sanskrit in Johns Hopkins University more than 100 years ago. He spent many years studying the Atharva Veda and wrote a book, Collected Hymns from the Atharva Veda, which he thought was more or less representative of the whole text. Now, if you look at this collection made by Maurice Bloomfield, you will find that the majority, almost 50% I would say, they relate to health and disease, not about spiritual subjects. This is why Charaka said, you must be reverential to Atharva Veda. And there are also many references to Bhishaks in Atharva Veda. Bhishak is a doctor, a physician. So obviously it was a very familiar term at that time, indicating that medical practice was widely used, widely popular. That becomes clear from that reference. Now, what kind of medicine did they practice? It is of some historical interest. When Charaka talks about this, everywhere you see reference to Atharva Veda. I picked out one disease, a common disease which we have even today, jaundice. If a jaundice patient went to a physician, a bishak, in Atharva Vedic time, what could be the treatment at that time? It is of some interest. Now here is a physician, a bishak, and there is a patient lying on that charpai, a patient with jaundice. Now in this painting you will find on the head side of the patient, there is a cage with some birds which are colored yellow. On the foot side, you will see a bull there with a reddish color. And remember, Atharva Veda, many of these hymns were composed in the area of Afghanistan, Pakistan, that area. That is where many of these hymns were composed. There was a Saraswati river. Saraswati itself is referred to in Atharva Veda. So there, this red color was probably animals had that. Even human beings have a whitish, reddish kind of color. Now, this patient, the treatment was, they would make a paste of turmeric and milk. And this, the patient will be asked to take some by mouth. He would have an amulet tied around his wrist. And this would be daubed, painted all over the body with this paste. And then the physician, Bishak, would be chanting a hymn. Now, if you read the hymn, Morris Bloomfield gives that hymn, translation also. That hymn itself is very difficult to understand. It talks about the transference of yellow color, transference of red color. It doesn't make much sense if you read that alone. But there is a book called Kaushika Sutra. It is not a book, it is an annexure of Atharva Veda. That gives all these rituals. There is a ritual when this is being chanted. They always go together. A ritual is always accompanied by a hymn, a mantra. So that mantra, what it says is, it is a symbolic act. This physician, as he is chanting, the patient has to repeat after him. And this yellow color in the patient is being transferred to the yellow birds. That is the natural habitat of that color. It is also being transferred to the sun, where all the excesses will be burnt. And then, in that space vacated by the yellow color, this hymn invokes the red color from the cow, from the bull, to the patient. So this was believed possible at that time, so that the color is removed and a healthy color is restored. And he prays that this patient may get well. So this is the practice at that time. To give you an idea, it was faith-driven medicine. And this faith comes because it was believed at that time, all the diseases of human beings, these are punishments being awarded by gods who are offended by human transgressions. So many gods are invoked, Indra very often, Varuna, Agni, and very often the medicinal plants were also deified. That was the practice of medicine. Charaka's words, it was Deva Vyapasraya, that is faith-based medicine. That was what happened in Atharva Vedic time. Now comes a long Buddhist phase, as you all know, for almost 1,000 years. It was Buddhist India. And there are we have one disadvantage because we have no Buddhist books in Ayurveda or medical practice written in Buddhist times. There were a number of books. In fact, Charaka Samhita, Charaka himself says at the end of every chapter, I am redacting Agnivesha Tantra. Agnivesha Tantra was in vogue for several hundred years before him. So that was a standard text during Buddhist time, but that is lost. We don't have it. So we have no authentic works on medicine written during Buddhist time, even though they existed. What information we have is what we gain from religious texts of Buddhism. There are references to the development of an embryo, for example, references to anatomy, references to digestion. All these are mentioned in the religious books. That is our only source. So this is a serious defect. Like in our Ramayana, for example, there is a section dealing with the development of an embryo. It's just one page. From that alone, you cannot imagine what Ayurveda was. This handicap we have that we must remember. But Buddha's own dialogues, when you read, you will see many references to herbs, salts, medicinal oils, alkalis. All these are mentioned in his conversations because there are many of them health-related conversations. So you will see these references. And many ideas in the Ayurveda, such as dosha, this term you will find. The branches of Ayurveda, 8 branches, 7 of them are mentioned in Buddhist texts. Anatomy of the human body. In some ways it is very good, that is described. And the classification of food, which we have very elaborate in Ayurveda, this also you will find in these religious books of Buddhists. So there is no reason, and there is a great deal of emphasis on hygiene, toilets, how to build them, how to maintain them. That is much more elaborate in Buddhist texts than we find in Ayurveda. So we have no reason to doubt that the practice of medicine in Buddhist time was the forerunner of Ayurveda. But the interesting thing is the Ayurveda, that term is never used. Neither in the Atharva Veda nor in the Buddhist texts. Now, medicine in Buddhist India continue. Procedures such as Panchakarma, which is universally practiced all over the world now, and surgery for anal fistula, these are described in Buddhist texts. In fact, Buddha actually sees a Buddhist monk who had a fistula operation done, he developed complications. He goes and looks at him. There are the descriptions of all these. Then there are universities of Takshashila, which is now in Pakistan, and Nalanda. Both these universities had very important subject was medicine. In fact, Nalanda we have greater information. There the first subject, the primary subject was Mahayana Buddhism, but the second subject was Ayurveda. So these great universities, in fact Takshashila was the alma mater of a very great surgeon called Jivaka, who was Buddha's physician. A lot of information is available on this. We can give lectures on them. But these universities flourished during the Buddhist period. Buddhism spread beyond India during Buddhist period because many of the students, like you may have read, Nalanda, for example, 10,000 students, a large number of them came from other countries, like Tibet, from China, Southeast Asia, many countries, Sri Lanka, Nepal. Many of these students, when they went back, they took books, manuscripts with them. Sometimes the teachers also went with them. So Buddhism Ayurveda going beyond the borders of India, that started during the Buddhist period. In fact, there is a famous manuscript called Bauer manuscript, I won't go into that. That was discovered in Central Asia, even beyond. So the Ayurveda traveling beyond Indian borders, that happened during this time. But there is the most important thing is there is no reference to rituals or mantras in the entire Buddhist literature. Because as you know, Buddhism never accepted the authority of Vedas. They refused to use the word Veda. So there is no mantra, which was the central part of Atharva Vedic practice. You will find the rituals and the mantras that disappeared from the mainstream of Ayurveda. Then followed the 1st century to 6th century, I would say the systematization of Ayurveda. That is the Ayurveda which we see today. It is recognizable during this time. And systematization, several things happened. 3 authoritative texts came, the Brihatrayi, the Great Three. But the first one, the Charaka, they were not original texts, except Bhagavata, I'll come to that. The first was Charaka, which was a text called Agnivesh Tatra, which existed in Buddhist period. I have already referred to that. That was composed by Agnivesha. He was a historical figure because he was referred to by Panini in the 4th century. So that was a redaction. Charaka says at the end of every chapter, Agnivesha Tantre Puna Samskrite, I have redacted this. So that text existed, but a redaction became the authoritative foundational text of Ayurveda. The second was Sushruta. Sushruta lived even earlier, 600 BC. Panini again refers to him. These are historical figures. He lived in Benares. He wrote a Sushruta Tantra. Most of it was surgically oriented. Unlike Charaka, who lived in the west, the Punjab, Kashmir, that area, Sushruta lived in Benares. And his text was surgically oriented. It is a general textbook of medicine, as authoritative as Charaka. But that went through several redactions until what we have today is a redaction made by Nagarjuna in 4th century. That is what we have. In the 6th century, a third figure appears, Vagpata, who was born in Sindh, and he wrote 2 texts. It was not redaction, he wrote on his own, but he says he based this on Charaka and Sushruta. And 2 books, one is Ashtanga Hridaya, the other is Ashtanga Sangraha. But all these great texts which I referred to, whether it is Charaka, Sushruta or Ashtanga Sangraha, they are strictly business, like a textbook of medicine today. They deal with the subject. They don't worry about the style or the poetry. But Ashtanga Hridaya is an exception of Vagpata. It is very great poetry. You love to chant it. You love to learn it by heart. So sometimes one wonders whether Vagpata was a greater physician or a greater poet. That is one great text, Ashtanga Hridaya. All these 3 great acharyas, they are the Brihatrayi of Ayurveda. Charaka says, in Atharva Vedic time, it was Deva Vyapasraya. It was practice of medicine was based on faith. But today, that is during the systematization, it has become Yukti Vyapasraya. It is based on reason. This is a very extremely important statement that he makes. The transformation of Ayurveda from the old ancient times to based on reason. Then came a phase of stagnation after 6th century, and we don't hear about Sushrutas or Vagpatas or Charakas anymore. And we don't hear about great universities, Takshashila or Nalanda. But what is much more important, to me at any rate, this decadence or stagnation, it came along with a very great social change which was happening in India. We don't know the full reasons for it. The only person who has studied this and written about it was Acharya P.C. Ray, perhaps the founder of modern chemistry in India. His History of Chemistry, which he wrote more than 100 years ago. It's a wonderful book. There he goes into this question. Because what happened during this period, the early years of the current era, early centuries, all that people are doing with their hand, a surgeon who was venerated in Sushruta's time, a person doing the same operations, by the 2nd century, he was considered a low-caste man. People who were working on metals, we were making rustless steel in India, famous all over the world. But the man making the rustless steel in the 2nd century, he was considered a low-caste man. So there are, everywhere you see this, people using their hand to make things of great importance, of great beauty, they all became downgraded in caste. That means they had no access to education, they had no access to social mobility, they were stuck in that. And this happened to millions of people. And P.C. Ray says, mind, the brain and the hand were disconnected. People were very skillful doing these things with their hand. Repeatedly they are doing, highly skillful, admirable. But they are not able to innovate because the brain is not connected to the hand. Now that point, he says, India's soil became morally unfit for the birth of a Newton or a Boyle, and her name was all but expunged from the history of natural sciences. This is what P.C. Ray writes, very strong language, but entirely justified. That is why the decadence for almost 1,000 years, you don't find, there are of course contributions here and there, but not this kind of revolutionary advances. That stopped at that time. The Ayurveda, of course, it is a miracle that it survived during this long phase. And the only reason it survived, we can say the Islamic rule, for example, Unani system became the official medicine. Ayurveda did not get any support. And when the colonial rule replaced the Islamic rule, they never accepted Ayurveda as science at all. They called it herbal therapy. They knew that the herbal treatment works under certain circumstances for certain diseases. That they accepted. So they even set up research institutes for that. But beyond that, they never accepted Ayurveda as a science. So the Ayurveda got absolutely no support from the government, from anybody, but it survived because there is an intrinsic vitality in this medicine. That is something which needs an explanation. And secondly, the faith of people. Millions of people, poor people, they had only this and they would go. They had faith. Even today, you can see that. Not any scientific proof, because by experience, they think it works. So these were the two factors which enabled Ayurveda to survive during this long phase of stagnation. Now, Charaka Samhita, I'll spend the first, I would say the Ayurveda which we practice today. That is the lengthened shadow of two people, Charaka and Sushruta. So I'll be spending the first part, I'll be talking about Charaka, Charaka's contributions, and the second, Sushrutas. Sushrutas will be mainly like a gallery, pictures, surgery. I won't be going because both are medical texts, but Sushruta has a surgical orientation. So I'll be dealing with one after the other. Charaka Samhita will start. He lived in the 1st century, and there is a consensus he was a contemporary of Kanishka. The Mathura was the capital where he lived, and many of the carvings and all that, you can see them in the Mathura Museum even today. A very great emperor. And there is a Chinese text which talks about Kanishka taking walks with Ashokosha, a great poet who wrote Buddha Charita, and Charaka, the physician. So there is a description. So there is a belief that he was a contemporary of King Kanishka. He redacted Agnivesha Tantra, and Agnivesha was a historical figure, I already mentioned that. Charaka Samhita was translated into Persian, into Arabic in the 10th century, into English in the 19th century. And Charaka's name was so inspirational in New York in the 19th century. They set up a Charaka club for physicians. And one of the prominent members was Sir William Osler, who is one of the founders of modern medicine. And Charaka Samhita is a living text because in the 21st century, this century, there is a critical edition of Charaka Samhita being prepared in the University of Vienna by Professor Vujastik. So it is still taught everywhere. It's a remarkable thing, a text which he redacted 2100 current era, being studied, used for practice. There are 120 chapters in this, prose as well as verse. And some areas, especially the prose, when you read, it resembles the Brahmanas, which is part of the Vedas. And it is all, as I said, there is no poetry in Charaka. Here and there you may see some line, but otherwise he's only bothered about the text, subject, series. And many of these chapters, interestingly, unlike ancient texts, these are actually discussions taking place, as if somebody took notes of these and they are republished. There is a chairman, Atreya usually is the chairman, and the chairman himself will introduce a subject. And there are students, usually about 7, 8 like that, coming from different countries. In those days, Panchala, different areas. Today they are not countries, but in those days they are different countries, coming from as far away as Bihar, as far away as Afghanistan. All these people would come. It's an international conference. So the names mentioned are only around 7 or 8 people. And the theme is introduced by the physician, the chairman, Atreya, and these students would respond. That gives you an idea. Sambhasha, Charaka says, the best way of learning is through these discussions, what we would call a seminar. And it's very interesting because the free discussions, it's a distant echo we are hearing 2000 years later. The Acharya says 4 components are necessary for the practice of medicine: the patient, physician, the attendant, and the drug. These 4 are necessary, and each of them there are 4 properties which he describes. If all these 16 are in place, the treatment will succeed. It must succeed. He says that. That is the theme for discussion, a proposition. But one of the students immediately says, Acharya, but we do see when all these 16 are there, some patients die. When they are not complete, patients are living. So maybe that is not correct. So he refutes the teacher. So that is the kind of freedom they enjoyed at that time in these discussions. Very interesting. Most important in Charaka, unlike the other texts, Sushruta or Vagpata, he has a great deal of emphasis on philosophical themes. That's why at the University of Vienna, they are all interested in Charaka. Because the central theme in Charaka is always the healing, how to stay out of illness, how to get out of illness. That is the central theme. But there is a background to this, a vibrant background, which contains a lot of philosophy. That's why there is international attention even today. So he was a great philosopher and a physician of great distinction. Though reverential to Atharva Veda, Charaka Samhita has very few hymns or rituals. None, I would say. There are some prayers when somebody is undergoing a major treatment for a very serious illness. That kind of prayer is there. But from the treatment point of view, you find these rituals. Jaundice treatment, for example, we have seen what they did in Atharva Vedic time. If you look at Charaka Samhita dealing with jaundice, it's just like modern medicine. Charaka Samhita symptoms are there, clinical features are there, causation, there is a discussion of that, how to treat this patient. There is no ritual, there is no mantra. Mostly panchakarma will be done, patient will be advised to take rest, a large number of medications are mentioned. It is a standard treatment of medicine today. So there is a very big difference in the treatment. Now this background which I mentioned earlier, if you look at a great painting, Last Supper, which all of you know this painting. In a painting, a great painter, he achieves harmony. There are diverse elements in this. By putting together different components in a cohesive manner, into a kind of a unified manner. Now in this, Christ is sitting there, silhouetted against a large window. And if you look, you get the impression there are so many lines in the background. They're all converging towards him. There is a central figure and fading away, receding away in the distance. Now if you have this, it is inconceivable that Leonardo could paint this without this background, that depth which you have, all the eyes of his disciples all concentrated on him, centripetal, everything is going towards the center. That impression, it could not be done in a flat screen. There is no background. If you take away the background in Ayurveda, which is Charaka's Ayurveda, you will find it will be reduced to another system of medicine. There are so many pathis today. It will be another system of medicine. That will be a great loss. It will not be Ayurveda or Charaka. So this is a good metaphor. Now I'll give some examples of this background. There is a whole lot. It's a very big book. So man and cosmos. Strictly it has nothing to do with what does it do with the practice of medicine? But that's not what Charaka says. One of the constant themes in Ayurveda, man is a microcosm and the universe is the macrocosm. They are made of the same 5 elements, Panchabhutas, not the elements of the periodic table. The elements in Panchabhutas is ether, air, fire, water and earth, increasing in density one to the other. Now all the derivatives of these bhutas, they constitute the universe. They are all accessible to the senses. And the same elements constitute the human body. And if they are identical, the composition of the universe and the human body, then they do interact. And the interesting thing is, Charaka makes it applicable to medicine because according to him, in Ayurveda, if you have changes taking place in the composition of the body, which happens in disease, some elements will increase, some elements will decrease. Now, how do you manipulate this? How do you bring them back to normal? So in Ayurveda, there is a principle. If you use an opposing element, suppose there is one excess, an element which is opposed to it in properties, if you put it together, that increase will come down, it will reduce. That is opposites. It is something which modern medicine accepts. There is a lot of acidity, you will give an alkaline substance. It is different from homeopathy, incidentally. So this principle, so internally the composition is changed. External substances which are homologous of opposing properties you are using in the form of diet, in the form of drugs to bring down that excess within. So for therapeutic intervention in Ayurveda, he gives a Panchabhuta explanation for it. It's an interesting way, Panchabhuta doctrine having a role in Ayurvedic therapeutics. But you can see, this is a very big subject, I am oversimplifying it, I realize it, but that is man and cosmos. Then take the example, everybody is wondering this enormous diversity of the universe, immense diversity. How did it all originate? How did it evolve? Now these questions, they are not new questions. That is a field which has been plowed in India by the Sankhya philosophers for many centuries. Here, Professor Dasgupta, who is the most reputed historian of Indian philosophy, he says that Charaka was the originator of the Moola Sankhya, the original Sankhya. Sankhya system is a system of Indian philosophy. According to Professor Dasgupta, Charaka was the originator of the Moola Sankhya, the original Sankhya. It went through various stages. Now that Sankhya is something like this. To begin with, Avyakta. Avyakta is indeterminate, undifferentiated, amorphous, that kind of an existence. It is in perfect equilibrium, nothing happening. Now within that there are three forces, Sattva, Rajas and Tamas. These are forces. They are also in equilibrium. Now that Avyakta, in Sankhya or Ayurveda, they say it is their tattvas, that is the term they use, the first tattva. That is Avyakta, indistinct, literally. Then something happens, a perturbation. Along with that perturbation, which is not predictable, which is not controllable, there all these things get disturbed within. Once that happens, that itself is not predictable. It's not controllable. But from then on, a series of changes, like a cascade, one follows the other. Now that is not random. It is always constant. In philosophy, they will say the first is a chance. All that happens next, the sequence, the cascade, that's a necessity. Chance and necessity. It is something like in medicine when we learn coagulation of blood. It always reminds me of that. Charaka didn't say that. But when I read coagulation of blood, which is very important for us, because that's how we live. If a scratch, we kept on bleeding, we could bleed to death. But bleeding automatically stops. That is because of coagulation. So the clotting may start due to many, many causes. We don't know all the causes. But once that clotting begins, then there is a series of sequential cascade. Actually, it is called a cascade. That cascade is constant. Factor 8, factor 9, etc., etc. We learn it. This is something like that. That first part we don't know. We can't control. But then it starts. And that first stage, Mahat, awareness, consciousness, that comes. Earlier it was not there. And the next is individuation. Earlier it was one collective mass, amorphous mass. Now it is individuation comes. And the next is the five bhutas. Others later on, after Charaka, they have introduced predecessors or forerunners of bhutas called tanmatras. Charaka doesn't describe that. He straight away says from ahankara, individuation, then these 5 bhutas are there. Now these 8, starting from avyakta to the 5 bhutas, 8 tattvas, this is what nature, prakriti, in Ayurveda, Sankhya, according to Charaka. Now evolution doesn't stop with that. This 8 prakriti begins to evolve. That becomes 10 senses, our indriyas, sensory, motor, 5. And mind. Mind is also part of this. And mind is the conductor of the sensory orchestra. 10 players, and the conductor is the mind. So we have, if you take that is 11, we have added to 8. Then there is, these senses have to do something. If the sense of vision, you have got to have objects to see. Sense of smell, you have to have things which you can smell. So objects of senses, indriyarthas, that is 5. So if you take total, it is 24. This 24 or Chaturvimsati in Sanskrit, according to Charaka, that is evolution, parinama. Now this evolution later on became 25 because in this Charaka's doctrine, you will notice there is no external agent here. It is all intrinsic, these changes take place. Darwin's evolution, which we all know, biological evolution, it doesn't stop like this, it keeps on going, it is never ending. We don't know in what direction it will go. Whereas our parinama here, at this stage, indriyarthas, that is universe, all that you see, they are indriyarthas, which our senses can pick up. At some stage, an infinite time, this will dissolve, go back to avyakta again. So there is a process of evolution. At some point, it will go back to involution again. So this keeps on alternating. That is the Charaka's Mula Sankhya, 24. But in this, there is no external agent. There is no need, if you are suffering, you pray to God. There is no God there. Nobody out there to listen to you. This is what Charaka's Mula Sankhya. But later on, this became too harsh. People want somebody to whom they could appeal. They could cry on their shoulder. They need it. That is how 25th came, a Purusha. That's a later development. Now this is Charaka's Mula Sankhya, which many science, Dr. Ramana, who was in Bangalore, as you know, he was a very great physicist, but he was also greatly interested in philosophy. He used to tell me, we used to talk about this, and he was very fond of this Mula Sankhya. Just on side. Another Ayurvedic background, another part of it is Samya, equilibrium. There should be what we call well-being, not only health, well-being, more than health. That is dosha Samya. Doshas are products of metabolism, we won't go into that. That must be in balance. Agni Samya, everybody knows there is a fire in the stomach, the most important, Jatarakni. But a different type of fire is burning in the muscle, in the blood, in the bone. All the 7 dhatus, fires are burning, specific to them each. They are also burning 24 hours. They must be in balance. Ritu Samya. There must be a balance between the environment and our body. There cannot be any disequilibrium. Then Agni Samya, I have already said, Hetu Samya. Hetu, that is interesting. I had an acharya from whom I learned Charaka Samhita, Raghavan Thirumalpad. Hetu is a cause. How can you have an equilibrium with the cause of a disease? That didn't make any sense to me. So I asked him, how do you have equilibrium between the cause of a disease and the body? So he explained to me, what it means is this: causes are so many, there are millions of causes of diseases. They exist outside, they exist within the body. You cannot sanitize all this. You cannot sanitize your body. You cannot sanitize the environment. They are always there. But we are not sick. Most of us sitting here, we are not sick. Even though if you take a throat swab of all of us sitting here, you will find all kinds of organisms, including pathogenic organisms. But we are not sick. Now here, cause is existing, but you are not sick. That is Hetu Samya. So simple presence of a bacterium, I'm just illustrating this, simple presence of a bacterium, that alone does not produce disease. There is something else, there is a state of equilibrium. That is what is protecting you. Now if that protection, that barrier is broken by your own ill conduct, suppose you take alcohol or smoking, various things we do, that barrier is broken, then the causes begin to operate. This is what Hetu Samya means. I remember he's explaining that. It made sense. Now, another is destiny. In a textbook of medicine, there is no role for all this. But Charaka was very conscious because the common question a physician faces, patient is not interested in the ICD classification of the disease. How is the scan done? He's not interested in all that. His primary interest is what will happen to me? What will happen to my child? This is the question always. Is life predetermined? There is a view, this is the big problem physicians face. We cannot just operate and go away and ask somebody, social worker, to talk to them. That's not the way medicine is practiced. We have to get into the suffering of that patient. That is how a good physician works. So Charaka was very conscious of this. And there was always a view in India that life span is predetermined. That cannot be changed. Vidhi. All over India you will find this. That's why many foreigners regard Indians as fatalistic, because of this. But what is not known, there is a lesser known view in India. Human effort can overcome any destiny. That is what is called Paurushaya view. It is propagated or emphasized in a great text called Yoga Vasishta. That is one great Indian text, almost as important as other texts, which repeatedly says this. There is nothing the human effort cannot achieve. That view is also there. But Charaka took a middle ground. His view was always he tended to do that. It has a Buddhist ring about it. That is, past actions, certainly, it's an interplay of two forces. One is the past action, the law of karma. It has got an action, a force. If past action has a force, present action also must have a force. Now the interplay of these, that is what determines lifespan. Agreed. A past action, for example, a serial murderer of enormous sin. Now that, the force is so great, no current activity can overcome that. It is immutable. It will operate. But then these are rare exceptions. The great majority of people, this evil acts like these, they don't apply. Most of us, we make mistakes. We make errors. There are lapses on our part. They don't rank with serial murders. So Charaka even calls them prajnaparadha. I know that smoking is not right. It may give lung cancer, but I still smoke. This kind of mistakes, overeating, too much of sugar, various, we know that that is not right for us, but we still do it. These kind of things happen all the time. Now, these cannot be the force that certainly has a negative effect, but these can be neutralized, even eliminated, prevented by present action, because that has positive force. So the past action, which is negative force, is counteracted by present activity. Now this view essentially is a very positive view, encouraging, hopeful. It energizes us to action. That is Charaka's view. So a destiny, the way he discussed, ordinary doctors don't discuss this. But Charaka goes into this. And there are many other subjects like these. Environmental destruction, Janapado Dhvamsana, destroying the habitat, leading to epidemics. He has another section on that. Again, the epidemics he will bring down, the causation is the human action. A king a rapacious king. He keeps on taxing people, waging unjust wars, ruining the country. There is a famine there. Now the cause, you may say, is something, but essentially it is his mind, that ruler's mind. So like that, Janapada Dhamsa, you get into a very different type of discussion, perception. So this is destiny. I give this example. Now the main theme of Charaka, these are all from the background. The main theme is Swastha Vritta, remaining healthy, and Adhura Vritta, healing the sick. These are the two central themes of Ayurvedic medicine, Charakas. And the Swastha Vritta received the highest priority. An elaborate code of healthy living, which is given in very great detail, covering diet, personal habits, hygiene, attitude, social relations, etc. It goes into many, many pages, how to live. Lifestyle change is recommended to suit the climate. Charaka lived in the north, extreme cold, extreme heat. You have to make suitable adjustments in your diet, in your lifestyle. Those are important. That Ritu Samya, earlier on I mentioned that. And the code is aimed at avoiding, they can all be to the senses which we have. We should not overuse them. We should not underuse them. Like if you don't use it for a long time, you lose it. So you have to use, moderate use and misuse. Like for example, taste is an important sense. When you are eating something, you are using that sense. But if you keep on excessive use, overeating, that leads to obesity and all kinds of problems. If you don't use it, that is starvation, a famine, for example. That is also not good. And disnutrition, you eat all kinds of wrong things, fried food, this, that. A lot of problems we see because of disnutrition or misuse of the senses, like these. So the use of senses, that should be optimal. That is very important. And virtuous conduct, that he always emphasizes. According to Charaka, a healthy life has to be a righteous life. Forgiveness, compassion, truthfulness, all these, that is an essential part of a healthful living. Then there are 8 branches of Ayurveda. This all came during the systematization, that Shalya, which is surgery, Shalakya, head and neck surgery, Kaya Chikitsa, what is called general medicine, Kaumara Vritti is pediatrics, Agara Tantra is toxicology, Bhuta Vidya is what could be called psychiatry, Rasayana is rejuvenation therapy, and last is Vajikarana, which is treatment of sexual dysfunction and sterility. That comes. Though these are all the branches. And to assist in the recovery of Samya. It is not eliminating a cause. That is not here the practice of medicine is based on this. That Samya, equilibrium, had been disturbed, we should re-establish that. That is the aim. And it requires a quartet, a physician, patient, assistant, and the medications, which I have already referred to. And that must be there, all in place. And the patient coming itself, initial assessment along with diagnosis, you should consider whether it is curable. Is it curable with difficulty, or is it incurable? If it is incurable, the attitude is one of masterly inactivity. You should not give false hope to patients. You should not bluntly tell them he is going to die. You should be compassionate. So that at the same time, masterly inactivity, because if you keep on doing futile treatment procedures, asking them to do this, do that, they spend a lot of money. You know very well it's not going to work. You're harassing them. That's why masterly inactivity. You should give them courage, comfort, but don't subject them to unnecessary treatment which you know to be useless. And it is important that knowledge, skill and compassion, these are the 3 important things Charaka talks about. You must know everything about the disease, about the patient's body, about the therapeutics, all that you must know, knowledge. Skill, you must know with your hand how to make a particular medication, how to do Panchatantra, all Panchakarma, all these you must know, skill. And thirdly, compassion. And there was a quotation from Will Durant had quoted Charaka, exactly this. You are practicing medicine not to make money, not to become famous, but for the healing of the sick patient. That is the aim. Ata bhuta dayam prati, for compassion. That is the reason you are doing. But it is important, today Ayurvedic practice is not exactly what Charaka said. There is often yoga, there are rituals, astrology, all these are mixed up with Ayurvedic practice today. I'm not an Ayurvedic physician, so I can't say anything about it. I can only talk about Charaka, but in Charaka's medicine, these hardly have a place. There is no place, no mention of meditation. There is no mention of Ayurveda, this Hatha Yogic asanas. He doesn't mention any of these. In fact, Charaka in one place says, Ayurveda, we are only concerned with what is accessible to the five senses. Anything beyond the senses, suprasensory, we don't deal with that. He says that. Now, diseases, there is an encyclopedic coverage of diseases. And all these diseases treatment, everything is based on the concept of three doshas. It is a disturbance, deviation from dosha, how to put it back to the equilibrium of dosha samya. The diseases affect the body and the mind, even minor diseases. Suppose I have a boil inside my nose, I'm constantly thinking about it. So it affects the whole body, mind also, even. But there are regional manifestations like head and neck diseases in terms of location. In terms of time, diseases which only affect the children, they don't affect the grown-up. So time-wise also, location-wise also, diseases can be limited. I did a study, interesting, I won't spend much time on that. What were the kind of diseases which existed in Charaka's time? 2000 years ago in North India, what was the disease prevalence, the epidemiology at that time? One way to do it, I thought, if you take a textbook today, a very common disease which is causing a lot of mortality and morbidity, you will find it described in 10 pages. Suppose a disease is very rare, you will find hardly one page. This practice was there even in old days. Charaka Samhita, 120 chapters. Some diseases are described at great length. Some diseases only one page. So if you look at the number of times that disease is mentioned on those, you get an idea, this was much more common than this. That's a very straightforward. So if you want to do that, you need to count the number of times, which physically you cannot do. Fortunately, we have computers now. So in a digitized version of Charaka Samhita, which we have, you can count. So when I did this count, I found that infectious diseases were much more common in Charaka's time than the present. And there are specialized texts in those days. If a patient needed surgical attention or obstetric problems or children or poisoning, they would be referred to specialists. Charaka himself says, you refer him. So that practice existed. And the aim of treatment is to restore equilibrium, not to remove causes. That is a very important distinction between the way we look at today and the way they looked at it at that time. And major simple illnesses where a patient feels, I don't feel well today, I'm sort of out of sorts. He doesn't know what is wrong with him, but he doesn't feel well. Now that kind of malaise, that treatment is essentially shamana. Shamana is rest, taking exposure to wind or to light sun, fasting. These are all the elements of this shamana. But all these are actually essentially what they are trying to do in this shamana. It is not doing nothing. Because as I mentioned, there is Agni, there is a fire burning in each of our tissues. There are 7 dhatus. Each dhatu there is a fire burning. Now the intensity of this fire, if it comes down for some reason, then that is when you get this kind of feeling. General feeling of not being well. Energy is not there. You don't want to do anything. You don't know what. Some disease may be incubating. But that time, these measures which in Shamana that you are doing, varied things, they are actually trying to enhance these fires. And that's how in 2 or 3 days they are fine. Many of them may not need any treatment. Suppose the disease further progresses and it gets into a major disease problem where all the products of metabolism in the body called doshas, they become very excessive, prolific. A man is bringing out large amounts of sputum with fever. If he develops pneumonia, something like that, not controlled by shamana at the early stage, progresses, then you require sodhana. That is where panchakarma is done, medications are given. That's a whole lot of, much of medical practice is based on that, sodhana. These are the two basic methods of treatment. Lifestyle, very important. Diet is very important. And a cheerful atmosphere, faith in the physician, all these are important elements. And this is a picture. In fact, I mentioned the Kushana Empire, that is where Charaka lived. Houses in Kushana Empire, in the Mathura Museum, you can see actual carvings of all these. So based on that, my artist drew this, a public building. Charaka describes a house for treatment. If you have 2 or 3 patients requiring this serious sodhana treatment, you cannot do it in his house. So there was a house for treatment. And he has described it. This is the artist's view of what Charaka has described, what it might have looked like. Now here, the patient's rooms are there. There is a room for the physician, room for attendants, a storeroom for medications. It should be in a nice place, not very windy or dusty. There should be plenty of trees around. Water bodies should be there, clear water. Cattle should be walking around, bird song, all these should be there. Not only that, there should be musicians and storytellers too, because patients, they like to hear these. So that is the description of a place for treatment in Charaka. Now we move on to surgery. This is a very, very brief summary, I must emphasize that again. Now surgery, it is interesting, Sushruta's teacher was the king of Kashi, Divodasa. He was believed to be an incarnation of Dhanvantari or a disciple of Dhanvantari. Anyway, he was a divine person. And when the students go to him and tell him, "Sir, we want to learn surgery," this is a quotation from Dhanvantari's reply. He says, my children, Shalya is the most important among the branches of Ayurveda because it produces quick results from the use of instruments, alkali and cautery, and comprehends all that other branches of Ayurveda contain. It unbars the gates of heaven and is eternal, virtuous, worthy of high repute, and generous in providing a means of living. A very high praise. This was the credo of Sushruta. He took it from his teacher. And Sushruta, what we know about him, he was a resident of Benares, disciple of Divodasa, descendant of Dhanvantari. Lived before Buddha's period because Panini refers to him. And there is another important point is in the large number of operations he has described. He doesn't describe trephining of the skull, which Jivaka described. Jivaka came later with Buddha. So Jivaka did this trephining, which did not exist in Sushruta's time. So that also shows Sushruta lived before Buddha. And his original text was revised several times, and what we have is Nagarjuna's redaction. And his original Samhita ranks with Charaka Samhita as an authoritative text. It was also translated into foreign languages and still continues to be a very important authoritative text. Now in surgical care in general, he described pre- and post-operative care in great detail, how fumigating the rooms, especially the treatment room, operating room and all that, what kind of plants will be used in fumigation, everything is described. And briefing the patient and relatives about the operation, pre-operatively, that should be done. And royal authority, before doing any procedure, a serious procedure, he has to get the approval from the royal office. And in those days, if you read the Arthashastra, Kautilya's, there he says, a person who is keeping a treatment house, like what you saw Charakas, or is doing major procedures which may have a bearing on life, he can have, king can punish him. If there is a death or a mishap of that kind, he can even have death as punishment. So there was severe punishment, so they had to take the approval before doing this. Similarly, before the physician decided the treatment or the training of the person is complete, if he was confident, he has to get the permission from the royal authority, a license, before he could practice. This was emphasized. If he did it without that, he would be punished. Now I will just show you a series of pictures, Sushruta's operative techniques. I'm not going to getting into medicine, that will be a repeat. Now here, surgery, an operation has many different things that we are doing. We are cutting, we are scraping, we are cutting out something, we are stitching it. So each one is a procedure. So here, how did they teach in training? Sushruta is one of the first to use simulation in teaching procedures. Now here, for example, first is excision. This is actually a pumpkin or something like that. That is used for students using the knife, how to cut it out. Second is incision, abscess has to be opened. It is an inflated balloon when you do that. This scraping, another. Puncture, suppose somebody has got a fluid collection somewhere in the body, you want to aspirate it, you want to put a needle, puncturing. That is shown here. This is in a lotus stalk. Now suppose there is a foreign body inside, you want to probe it. That is called, here is a probe being used in a moth-eaten piece of wood, a hook type of thing, specially designed for this. You can scrape it and locate it. Now once you locate it, you have to take it out, extraction. That is used by this, aharya. Now in one operation you may be doing 3 or 4 of these, but this is only to show that simulation, familiar objects are used to teach. Now here is the stitching. They used cotton threads, silk threads and leather, etc. were used to make these. Needles were prescribed. Now here is another one, which how to give enemas. That is taught how to, there is a hole through which you introduce, and with a balloon you insert a fluid. That is being done here. So these are all taught in models as simulation. Then there are bandages, different types after operation, after fracture and all that. There are 14 types of bandages. Some of them are difficult, like on the face, for example. How do you apply a bandage? Even today, we have to learn that. So these are also taught in models. So more bandages. For example, rib fracture. Fracture you have to immobilize, but here chest you cannot immobilize because we have to breathe. How do you bandage that? So all these are described. Now fractures, very elaborate. 12 different types of fractures are described, including compound fracture, comminuted fracture. These are all described. How the reduction is done by manipulation, how it is stretching, how it is immobilized, and bandages are used. So there is a very elaborate description of treatment. In fact, if a patient came with a malunion, many times in India, even now, distant places, they have a fracture, they had no medical assistance. So the fracture united in a malformed manner. There is a malunion of the bone. That's the stage at which they come to the doctor. So Sushruta says you have to break it again and reset it. That's what he writes. Now here again you see the bones, different fractures. I won't go into the details, but you see how much in detail, in a time there was no X-ray, all by physical examination and intuition, you find and treat it. Now here the jaw fracture, all these he has seen. Fractures were very common at that time. Fall from trees, fall from vehicles, animals attacking. So they were extremely common. There is a very large section, foreign bodies and fractures. Instruments, another very great achievement of Sushruta, 100 blunt instruments and 20 sharp instruments. He classifies them, yandras and shastras. Now these are some examples of blunt instruments, different types of forceps, mostly used for removal of foreign bodies or urinary stones and so on, impacted somewhere. And these are, all of them are named, nowadays instruments are named after surgeons. In those days they were named after lion face, tiger face, because the artist, the craftsman making this. Sushruta has a lot of admiration for them. They are called karma kovidas. They are very good metal craftsmen, and not only making something for utility, but also very beautiful. The animal face of different kinds. Bear face, wolf face, hyena face, like that. They are named after that. Now here, Pyle's operation was very commonly done, and here is an endoscope, which is used to put in and to see that pile, whether you want to inject it, whether you want to excise it, it is done through this. So this also it is used in vagina. So this instrument, endoscopes, were described. And these are wound syringe, cannula to tap and so on. These are all blunt instruments. Now we come to the sharp instruments, scissors, needles and so on. So there are very detailed description of these instruments. He describes the dimensions of these, how they should be cleaned, after cleaning how they should be stored, all these are described. Now there comes the plastic operations, ear operation, the Karnavedha, piercing the earlobe was practiced there at that time. Almost every child would have it. But unfortunately many of them would develop infection. And sometimes if the infection was uncontrolled, that earlobe, the bottom part, that will become necrosed and shrunken. So it's highly disfiguring. Now that was repaired by using a flap, skin flap from below, and that is what is shown here. This was a plastic reconstruction described by Sushruta. He described not only this, plastic reconstruction of the lip, plastic reconstruction of the nose, which has received the maximum attention and publicity. Now this is the plastic repair of the nose. I would like to stop here with a story on this. It's a very important, interesting story. Now this was all described in Sushruta Samhita, everybody knows it. But as I mentioned earlier, by the 2nd, 3rd century, this was not being done by any Ayurvedic physician. All these procedures disappeared from the mainstream of Ayurveda. But it did not disappear from the country. These were being done by people here and there, in the periphery of the society, in the fringes of the society. They were lower caste people. No education, no possibility of getting education. They were always in this operation, interestingly, which nobody was doing in the practice of medicine. In 19th century, a large number of British observers came here. They had not conquered India. It was between, say, something like 1780 to 1810, around that time. They did not think they would conquer India. So a good number of observers, some were clergymen, some were military men, some were scholars, some were doctors. They all came here and lived in India for 10 years, 15 years like this, keenly observing whatever they saw, making records of these. They would send it to England. Many were published, many were not published. And Dharampal, a Gandhian, who passed away a few years ago, he took interest in this. In 1970s, he published, taking 20 or 22 reports of this kind, and published a book. It was an eye-opener for everybody, including Jayaprakash Narayan, that Indians were doing all this. Indians were making rustless steel. How are they making it? We didn't know that. We have no records. But these British observers have written exactly 4, 5, 40 pages on that steel making, with diagrams, how the furnace looks, everything is there. Now this operation, incidentally, which made India famous, everywhere they talk about the rhinoplasty. The minister was talking about it. Now this operation happened because, this is the story I want to tell you, in Bombay, there was an East India Company doctor called Scott. Most of the East India Company doctors, there were not many, but they took no interest in the Indian natives' treatment. They thought it was all rubbish. But this Scott was an exception. He took interest in this. So one day, a colleague, army man, British, he came to Scott and told him, there is a sepoy here whose nose has been cut off by Tipu. There was a war and the punishment was cutting off nose. So he is here, he wants 2 weeks leave. So he wants a medical certificate from Scott. So Scott said, how can you fix the nose? You must be telling a lie, it cannot be done. So this man, the patient's name was Koyaji. So Koyaji was brought and yes, his nose was gone. So Scott questioned him. He said, Saab, I have got my friend here whose nose was fixed. So he brought another man whose nose had been fixed. So Scott was incredulous. He said, all right, you give him leave to go to Pune. The man doing this was in Pune. Pune had not been, it was still Peshwas. British had not conquered. But British East India Company had a representative there. Sir Charles Mallet. He was the representative. So he wrote to Sir Charles Mallet, I am sending this man. They say it can be, somebody will fix it. Please have it observed by doctors and send me a report. So leave was given, this man went to Pune, and 2 East India Company doctors, Finlay and Crusoe, they were there watching. And their report is available. So this man went to, a patient went to this doctor, not doctor, he was a man sitting under a tree, he was doing something. And these people doing this operation, they always belong to Kumar caste, only that caste. That caste, they are potters. Only they would do this operation. So when he went there, he plucked a leaf from that tree, he had a razor, and he put it on that defective nose and cut a template, that defect. And then he put it on the forehead. In Charakas here, he is taking from the cheek. But in Pune, he put this leaf on the forehead of the patient. And with that razor, he cut a flap very skillfully. No anesthesia. He put some vegetable juice or something. We might have given local anesthesia, we don't know what it was. Then he turned his flap down, and the defective nose, he freshened the edges and fixed it with a vegetable glue, no stitches. All this was done, perfect composure, nobody to help him. And then he put cloth soaked in ghee as dressing and put 2 tubes in his nose to keep the nostrils open and told him to have to drop ghee twice a day and come and see me in 5 days. 5 days later, and this Crusoe and the 2 doctors, they went there to see, and Finlay. And they say there is a pretty good adhesion. Adhesion means sticking. No stitches. And it perfectly healed. Now this operation, the description, goes into several pages. They sent it to London. And there was a magazine at that time very popular called Gentleman's Magazine. It was, in fact, in Dr. Johnson, the lexicographer, those of you who have read his biography by Boswell, you will see many references to this because it was a very popular journal. This was published in that journal. And a British surgeon by name Carpo, he was a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of England, a trained surgeon. He saw this. And he was the first one to do this in the Western Hemisphere. And he wrote a paper. He waited for a few years to make sure that his healing was good. Then only he published. He was very careful. The Indian method of rhinoplasty. Now, there are many lessons in this. One is the great originality and the success of what we achieved more than 2,000 years ago. Unequaled anywhere in the world. But what happened to it in India? That is very great concern for us. Because if we don't know how this happened, there is every chance we will repeat it. Those who don't know history, they are bound, condemned to repeat it. That I will stop with this, and thank you very much for the chance you gave me to speak to you.
What was it that brought the social change that you mentioned? Was it Manu?
No, it is not Manu. One man could not create that. He was recording whatever he saw, he recorded. We don't really know. The only person, everybody knows that stagnation and decline. That's a fact. But what contributed to this? There is no real explanation for this.
I'm referring to Manu, the lawgiver.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So Manu, in fact, according to what we know, Manu preceded this.
Achha.
This decline which we are talking about, that is probably from the second, like Vagpada's time, 6th century. Already these have disappeared from mainstream Ayurveda. So it started earlier, and Manu was before that. So it was affecting not only in medicine, the steel making in India, which is an even more interesting story than this. The British were very much interested, East India Company, how do the Indians make this steel? Because the Indian steel, which they called Wood's steel, I don't know how that name came, that steel was used to make the Damascus sword. It's a very famous sword made from wood steel from India. So the East India Company, they were not particularly interested in the rhinoplasty. They were interested in steel. How do the Indians make it? So one of the things they did in that period, James Franklin, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, an engineer, he was sent from Calcutta, East India Company, to Jabalpur, Madhya Pradesh, where they have iron ore. So he went to Jabalpur. There is a long report, some 40-50 pages, with diagrams and all that. When he went there, he found the man making the steel. There was one man and his assistant, only 2 people. And he makes a smelter with his own hand. He does it very skillfully. All that he writes, he has made it, looks very crude, but inside the dimensions are all constant. And then the ore, how he makes pellets out of it, all with hand. He describes even the size of the pellets. And the pellets are filled, one layer, then charcoal. There was no coal there. So charcoal, then again pellets. Like that, the whole smelter is filled. And then it is lit. And there is a bellows, how they do that. And finally, it catches fire. And at the end of this burning process, the scoria keeps on pouring out from the top. Very beautiful description. And the melted iron drops at the bottom. Then this is taken, there is what we call a refinery, another mud structure, where this is further processed with leaves of some trees. And this may be one reason why it becomes decarbonization or something happening. That process, that is also built by these 2 people. And if there is a crack in something, he's not at all bothered. He fixes it and then gets on with it. Very much simplified. And this steel which was made in this manner was sent to, they had a mint, East India Company, in Nagpur. They sent it there. And that report says, in terms of malleability, so various properties, mechanical properties of iron, they have a series of metrics. In terms of all these, this compares with the best Swedish steel. This is what he writes, the report. But this man, Franklin was asking this man, through translators obviously, why do you attach the bellows like this? Isn't it easier if you do it like this? He would say, no, my father has taught me. That's all I will do. Why do you want to pack it like this? Isn't it easier if you use a different... No, I will. Every time he would get this reply. He could never say anything why it was being done like that. So that is why he says, manually it's extraordinarily skillful. So this Franklin says, this man is undoubtedly ignorant of anything about scientific basis of what he is doing. But the original designer was a superior intellect. This is what he writes. So we don't know why large numbers of these people, it became anybody a surgeon. Sushruta's time he was an acharya. But here, he is called an untouchable. This kind of a suicidal policy, how we did this, I cannot understand. Even P.C. Ray, he condemns this, very strong language. Perhaps the best, it is interesting, P.C. Ray's book was published in 1902. Wonderful book, he never went abroad. The Scottish University gave him a DSc for this book. He never went there. But that book, it was published. When I saw a quotation from this, I wanted to read the original volume, 2 volumes. I couldn't get it, it's out of print. Indian Chemical Society told me that it has been revised by his student P. Ray. There is a new edition, 1930, so I got that. I found in that volume all these social aspects which P.C. Ray described, they have been removed. It is only describing chemistry. All the rest they eliminated. I wanted to read it. Finally, with greatest difficulty, there is an Asiatic Society in Calcutta. I was sure the book should be there. You can't get anything from there. So finally, Professor A.K. Sharma, who was my predecessor as INSA president, I wrote to Professor Sharma, can you help me to get this? So he said, I asked him actually to go and talk to the people in the Asiatic Society. He said it is no use. And Ashima Chatterjee, one of the great scientists of India, she is no more. She was a friend of A.K. Sharma. He knew her daughter, Julie Sharma. So she had a copy, the 2 volumes, her mother's copy. I got a Xerox copy of that. There, all these are there. Wonderful language. I mean, the indictment he makes, India's soil became morally unfit for the birth of a Newton or a Boyle. How much stronger can it be? So those, we don't really, I don't have an answer.
For me, that is the real tragedy. About the same time, 300 AD, in China, they introduced a system of examinations where anyone, absolutely anyone, could study the classics and apply and study for that and appear for that examination. In India, we retained all our knowledge to 7%.
In fact, Sushruta we are talking about. Yeah. Sushruta became much more conservative. Not Sushruta, the redactions. You see, when Sushruta lived 900 years before the redaction that we are reading today. It had gone through many redactions. And these people like P. Ray, who redacted P.C. Ray, look at he eliminated a whole lot.
Sadly.
So we cannot blame P.C. Ray for it. So what happens, Sruta Samhita, it says the Ayurveda should be taught only to the 2 higher castes. Shudras are excluded. If at all a very bright Shudra comes, you can teach him minus the mantras, prayers and all that.
Anyone else would like to ask questions?
Yep. Yes, I'm glad you asked that. I didn't mention that. In Sushruta's method of instruction using models for surgery, he also had a description on cadaveric dissection. And he says that anatomy cannot be taught without cadaveric dissection. But in those days, even in those days, touching the cadaver, that was considered defiling. There was a kind of unofficial ban on touching cadavers. It's continued for many, many centuries. So the method he described was, a dead body should be taken in a shallow water and dipped there in a wooden crate with large gaps. So it is exposed to water, and in 3 or 4 days it will rot. And a rotting cadaver, not in broad daylight, not with people around, it should be done in secret, in other words. You have to use splinters of wood, no knife should be used. Sharp splinters of wood or sharp-edged leaves. With that, you scrape off layer by layer. That is how dissection was done. Now, this was a very imperfect way because you don't get a proper anatomy of the muscles even. You only get some idea about the bones, cartilages, teeth. So, the anatomy of the hard parts, they are reasonably accurate. But soft parts you cannot. That is what happened at that time. So in fact, the anatomy of the dead body much later, the first medical college which was established in Calcutta by East India Company, they initially had a system of two systems of medicine. One was first year English textbooks of anatomy, etc., they got it translated into Persian and English. That was taught. Then the second year onwards, it is a 3-year course. Second, third, and fourth, there will be 2 streams. The Hindus will be taught Charaka Samhita, and Muslim students, they will be taught Avicenna, some text from Arab medicine. So this was what was done 3 years. And this was opposed very vigorously by Rajaram Mohan Roy and all that. They wanted this abolished. They wanted the whole hog, everything, modern medicine only. So it's a very big agitation. So after 3-4 years, at that time William Bentinck or some Governor General was there, he agreed with great reluctance. They were terribly afraid that the students will object to dissecting the cadaver. And if there is a riot, then that would affect their empire. They don't want any public protest and riot and all that. So with great reluctance only they started the first dissection, cadaver. And one of the students, a Hindu, I think his name was Madhusudan Datta, who was attending that the Charaka course, he was selected for this. And he did this first cadaver. There was absolutely no problem. And within 3 years, they did 500 cadaveric dissections. So there was great fear and reluctance. It must have been much greater at that time. So he recognized the importance of cadaveric dissection, but the method was not satisfactory. Yes?
I have 3 short questions. My first one is in the context of Ayurveda. You've been saying, talking about Charaka and Sushrita, and they're all from central India or East India. But if you look at contemporary Ayurveda, we only hear of Kerala. So where did Kerala emerge from and why did it happen? That's number one. My second question is in the context of surgery, which Sushrita seems to have developed to a great extent. We get only a faint idea of what the anesthesiology that was used. You made a brief mention. Do we have any intelligence on what was the natural kind of anesthesiology used? Because obviously you need something when they're cutting up people in different ways. And my last question is, you mentioned a London-based physician called Karpel.
Yeah,
Was he Karpel? Dr. Karpel you mentioned in the context of this was sent back to London. Does he have something to do with the Karpal tunnel?
Carpo. No. Carpal tunnel is a corpus. That's not.
It has no reference to that doctor.
No.
Okay. So those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
Now I hope I can remember them. The sect Kerala, it's a very interesting question. In Kerala, it came through the Buddhists actually. The answer is very clear because Buddhism, as you know, Ashoka sent his daughter and son to Sri Lanka to spread Buddhism there. Now, along with that got all the name. But around the same time, either from many people claim in Kerala that from Sri Lanka people came to Kerala. Many people who claim that. There are also others who say they came from the north also, small trickle of people migrating along with Nambudris and all that. Before Nambudris, there was a traveling along the west coast, coming through between the Western Ghats on the eastern side and the sea coast. There is a corridor around Karnataka, Kerala border, some 50 kilometers. That was a place through which migration came from the north. Again, some Buddhists must have come like that around the same time. These Buddhists, when they came, they never recognized caste. Ayurveda, as I mentioned, Charaka, Sushrita, they all caste is there. So Buddhism had no caste. Anybody who is intelligent, who is willing to learn, who is interested in Sanskrit, it was taught in Sanskrit, they accepted as disciples. So it came through Buddhism. And there is an important sociological matter here. Professor Madhav Gadgil, some of you may know, he once asked me, how is it that in Kerala we have a community called Eedavas? They're a very powerful, very advanced community. But he asked me, how is it that Eadavas were untouchables? But there are so many Sanskrit scholars among them, Ayurvedic physicians. They are famous. How is it? It's a paradox. So I told him the reason is this. Because when the Buddhists came, they taught so many people. And then came the eclipse of Buddhism. And we had our caste system came in great force. So those who already had learned Sanskrit, they transmitted in their families. So family physicians, they are inherited from that time. That is how Ayurveda came into Kerala. There are of course people, there are legends like Vagpada, for example. Many people believe Ashtanga Hridaya is mentioned, very great poetry. Ashtanga Hridaya is the most popular book in Kerala. And in fact, my Acharya Raghavan Tirunpad, he said he used to learn it by heart. They had to learn it by heart. And because it is the poetry, the beauty is such, you will learn it by heart. But that Vagpada, many people believe, he was from Sindh, he was born in Sindh, he himself says that. He traveled like this all the way. And he came and settled in Kerala, because when he came to that Western Ghats, nobody will go, it's all forest. Sea coast also they didn't like. So in the middle stretch, in Thrissur area, he found a colony of Nambudris. They already knew Sanskrit, intelligent people, keen to learn. And they found here is a great Acharya. So he settled down there. This is what they believe. We have no proof for it. So Ayurveda became popular like that. The second question was... anesthesia. Now, Sushruta has described all these operations. There was no anesthesia. Neither in India nor in Europe. So what they did was, they would give wine in large quantities. And secondly, every operation they described, there should be a hefty assistant. This was true in Europe also. If you read 18th century or even first part of 19th century in Europe, amputations were common operations. And you have to be very fast. Now, surgeons can take a lot of time because anesthesia is there. We can do it slowly, we can take 3 hours, doesn't matter. We can be lazy. But in those days, it was not like that. The man is conscious, or woman. So the assistant had to be a hefty person, which Sushruta says that, hefty people. They have to hold him. But in London, there are actually descriptions. You go to Guy's Hospital, in the museum, you will see the amputation knives they used. I don't know how they could use that. We find it difficult to lift it. But the speed with which the thigh amputation, for example, assistant is holding the thigh. But the speed with which 2 minutes he would complete the amputation. But sometimes the assistant thumb would be chopped off. There are descriptions there. So in India we had, only came with nitrous oxide, a great contribution of chemistry by Humphrey Davy. That is a great altruistic contribution. With the anesthesia came. But we had only wine and physical control. Yes. There was one more question you asked.
May I say something?
No, his question I have not finished, the third. Carpo. Carpo spelling is no. Carpo is the name of a person. C-A-R-P-E-U. Carpo. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. I first ask one question about Dr. Prafulla Chandra Roy.
Yes.
P.C. Roy.
Right.
I read his book, Prachin Rasayan Vidya Itihas, Ancient History of Ancient Indian Chemistry.
No, Roy's name was not that.
Prafulla Chandra Roy.
Prafulla Chandra Roy, that book's name was History of Hindu Chemistry.
Okay. But probably in the Bengali version, the name was slightly different. I read that book in 1955-56 when I was 15, 16 years old.
Yeah.
I do not know, you mentioned that in English version has been located, but is it available in modern print? Is it in print today?
No, it is not. It is out of print. The printed book was available, and that is what the Asiatic Society, Mrs. Ashima Chatterjee, a few people might have. I could not get it from any publisher. It is out of print. Those who have it, Asiatic Society must have. But I failed to get it. They didn't even reply to my letters. Then I approached my friend, Professor Sharma. He was a good friend. So he took the trouble of going to Julie Chatterjee. From her mother's collection, he got a Xerox copy. That's what I have, 2 volumes. So I don't know who will republish it, copyright and all that, I don't know.
I think it is what publish it, because at the age of 15, 16, I was fascinated by that book.
No, it is a wonderful book. Apart from the chemistry, actually his interest was chemistry. Because Rasa Shastra, mercury actually came from Middle East. Ayurveda, Charaka, Sushrata, Vagpada, we don't hardly have any reference to mercury. So mercury came from outside, like pulse, counting pulse. Ayurveda doesn't have it. Charaka, Sushrata, Vagpada doesn't have. But today, Nadi Shastra, everybody says Ayurveda. It is Ayurveda today, but it is not originated here. So similarly, Rasa Shastra, mercury came from the West, from West Asia. That Ray's interest was, that is the beginning of chemistry. A lot of things, mercury purification, mercury reacting with various things. In fact, several books, Rasarnava and all that, he has written commentaries on that. So that was his primary interest, but then he went beyond.
My second question is a little different. You mentioned the name of S.N. Dasgupta, Surendranath Dasgupta.
That's right. Yeah.
Indian philosophy, 5,
Right.
6 volumes and all that. I wanted to mention that this Sengupta, Dasgupta, they belong to a class or caste in Bengal known as the Vaidyas.
Vaidyas, okay.
Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, is a Vaidya. He belongs to that community. Shashibhushan Dasgupta belong to that community.
I see.
They are the practitioners of Ayurveda. There's what caste they are considered to be very high caste, probably just below the Brahmins, and they are the practitioners there. Very intellectual, very intelligent people. They are also known, I don't know, in popular language as Kaviraj.
Kaviraj, yes.
That is
Yes.
the king of poets.
Right.
I do not know why the Ayurveda practitioners are also known as the king of poets. If you could throw some light on that. Third question is, in popular stories we hear that in the ancient days, the barbers
Yes.
were also practitioners of some minor surgery.
Yeah.
What could be the link? Of course, they also use some iron instruments and things like that, but you could throw some light on that also. Last question is that you mentioned the theory of disease linked to lack of equilibrium or 3 dosha, etc. in Ayurveda, whereas we read that in Western medicine, there's this so-called germ theory of disease, that diseases are caused by virus or microbes or some mosquitoes bring something. There must be some microbe in their blood or something. So is there any, can you make some connection between the disease theory of the Western style and the cause of disease theory of the Ayurveda?
No, I may have trouble remembering all of them, but I'll try. First of all, this Kaviraj, Professor Dasgupta, it is undoubtedly a very great book, his philosophy, this history of Indian philosophy. The Maharaja of Kuch Bihar or somewhere, he gave him the money to write it. He acknowledges that. It is undoubtedly a treat, as far as I am concerned. And it is unusual, like Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan's philosophy. He doesn't refer to Ayurveda or Charaka or anything. Most of the philosophy books in India, they never talk about Charaka. They only take, it is like he didn't have a formal PhD in that subject, so he has no right. A physician cannot be a philosopher. A philosopher can only be a philosopher. A physician cannot be a philosopher. Many people believe that. It's completely wrong. That is what he has exploded that myth, giving this specific examples. I didn't go into it, but there is no question that originator of not only in this particular parinama, but in logical parameters of debate, the quality of gunas mentioned in Vaisheshika. There are 3-4 areas where Charaka's contributions are original, and he has given the specific references. So he was a great intellect. I am a great admirer of Dasgupta. Sorry, I didn't know that they were professionally Vaidyas. That I did. Yeah, that I did. That explains it, because he has spent a great part, almost 2 long chapters on the philosophy from Ayurveda. So that explains that.
Why are they called Kaviraj?
That I don't know. I know they are called Kaviraj, but I don't know why they are called. But barbers, that is a Western. We don't have that here. Western, that is correct. In the European surgery, it is true. In fact, Royal College, I am a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. Every year, there is a joint dinner. It's a very prestigious dinner where the Council of the Royal College of Surgeons and the most worshipful company of barbers, that is their body. It is with a charter from the Queen. Now they have a joint dinner every year, even now. Now, like Henry VIII, all those time until well into 17th century, most of these surgery was done by barbers. And they did not have any social status, unlike here. Here, Acharya, Susruta was an Acharya. That kind of status they never had. Surgery did not have. In fact, the quotation I gave, he says, Shalya is the most important. First, you go straight to heaven and all that, he says. This status it never had there. So only after John Hunter in the 18th century, the scientific basis of surgery. In fact, John Hunter is I would say, is the patron saint of the Royal College of Surgeons. His statue sits there, blessing everybody. And to give you a quote from John Hunter, he says, and now the last part of surgery, namely operations, constitutes a reflection on the healing art. It is a tacit admission of the inadequacy of surgery. It is like an armed savage trying to get by force what a civilized man would get by stratagem. This is John Hunter.
Last question was John theory of disease and Tridosha theory of disease.
Now we have 3 doshas, they have 4 humors, and to find this is taken from there, here, they took it from here, this is a futile type of effort. You can never prove. There is no proof for any of this. If I am an Indian, I'll say the Greek took it from here. If you are a European, you will say they took it from here. All the impartiality is humbug. Our nationality, we are proud of it. We will never admit. It goes on and on. So instead of, we can have similar thinking. If diseases come, common sense. You go to tribal people, many of their ideas are common sense. It makes sense. For example, we use a lot of medicinal plants in making medicines. The Arabs don't. It is because Arabs don't have vegetables like we have. So they will use minerals and metals and all that in treatment. It has nothing to do with originality. It is common sense and the environment in which we live. So I don't know that, I have seen articles, Tridosha is being adopted by Hippocrates.
Last question.
And the Europeans, they keep on. In fact, there is a European scholar who will say that Sushruta did not exist because he can't accept this is all done by an Indian surgeon. Somebody else, we have learned it from.
Last question.
Sir, you briefly mentioned something that resembles psychological sciences that could have been an arm.
Sorry?
You briefly mentioned one of the arms of Ayurveda as something that could have been something like psychological sciences.
Yes.
My question is, what would psychological sciences have looked like at that time?
No, Bhuta Vidya, that is the title. Bhuta Vidya, if you read the description, it is called Unmada in Ayurveda, that section. Now that was, if you read the symptoms, in my legacy of Charaka, I even consulted our professor of psychiatry, P.V. Sharma. He's a product of Nimhan's, very eminent psychiatrist. And some of them you would plainly, they are like schizophrenia, descriptions very much like that. There are areas like depression. So you can detect many of the symptomatology. You know, the description of psychiatric illnesses, that annual book they publish, it is always controversial. Because you cannot prove it on the basis of existence of a test, bacteria or anything. So one set of definitions accepted this year, maybe changed the next year. This problem is there in psychiatry. So I consulted Professor Sharma, 3 or 4 of them he has found equivalents very similar to this hepatic encephalopathy. Jaundice, along with some mental symptoms, he has got jaundice, so it could be hepatic encephalopathy. Like that he has made an attempt. But I am not a psychiatrist, so I have not done too much study of that. That's why I consulted him. Certainly the treatment was not very satisfactory. When this medication, Panchakarma is described for them, large number of medicinal preparations are mentioned. And in difficult conditions where they are violent and so on, they can be incarcerated, physical restraint, all these are there. Yes?
There's a lot of effort to do what is called Ayush, the combination of different types of streams of medicine. How far has it been put in practice? For example, would a modern medicine practitioner be able to use, and would they like to use Ayurveda, Unani and so on? For example, you yourself as a cardiac specialist, would you and do you use these other streams of medicine?
That's a very contemporary question, very important. We have to accept whether I would like to use evidence-based approaches and treatment. I agree that in modern medicine also we don't have, all is not evidence-based. But my interest is primarily what benefits the patient. I'm not too much worried. That is my consideration. So if I find that my modern medical practice, sometimes it is not very satisfactory, we know that. And if I find that Ayurveda medicine is working, unfortunately we don't have evidence acceptable that a clinical trial is done. And clinical trial is not double-blind randomized trial which modern medicine does. But WHO has already said in 2000 that evidence is not necessary for traditional systems. They have liberalized that. There is no need for a control, etc. Now, unfortunately in India, even though those liberalized criteria came in 2000, there is not a single paper published from India. Ayurvedic trial conducted according to the liberalized criteria. So without any evidence, I would not use it. But I would still use it if, for example, somebody I know, Raghavan Tirumilpad, from whom I learned Charaka Samhita. There is a particular disease for which in modern medicine I know the treatment is not satisfactory. Some kind of an arthritis for which I have to give steroids and a cytotoxic drug, which have a number of problems. That is our treatment. I am not satisfied with it. But if Raghavan Tirumilpad tells me that he has treated this disease, this is what I am doing. It worked. I will use it. I have confidence in that. But not what somebody publishes in a newspaper. That kind of evidence I cannot accept. So we need to create, if at all any integration, it cannot be done by a government order, making the salary the same, increments the same. That's not the way to integrate. Integration will come only like this. If Ayurvedic treatment in areas where they have strength, where they believe treatment is good, they should produce this kind. It is done. It can be done like the WHO criteria. Why can't it be done? I have said this in several meetings. We have 35,000 Ayurvedic doctors being produced every year, some 300 Ayurvedic colleges. Why cannot 3-4 of them join together as a network and take one disease, WHO criteria? Disease inclusion criteria, disease is the same, that you have to be sure. And then the protocol for treatment, all Ayurvedic doctors do it. The duration of treatment, everything is done by them. But you cannot change for every patient. Because nowadays, personalized medicine, everybody talks about personalized medicine. Personalizing is for the patient, not for the doctor. Every doctor has his own treatment. That is not personalization. Personalization is the patient. Their individual treatment should be given. That can be done, provided we have this kind of evidence done through a liberalized type of trial approved by the WHO. Why can't we do it? But in the absence of that, simply because somebody says this is Ayurvedic treatment, I cannot use it. Or nobody should use it. I think we have exceeded our time. Thank you all very much.
Before we conclude, on behalf of NGMA Bengaluru, I thank Professor M S Valiathan and for this insightful presentation for today. May I now request Ms. Nazneen Banu, our Director of NGMA, and Sri Alin Nazaret sir to come down to the dais and present a memento to Professor, and I request the Professor to accept it.